Imagine being worshipped on stage, knighted in the press, toasted in Hollywood, and still managing to fumble your legacy with one gloriously idiotic decision. These weren't nobodies. They were legends. And yet, somewhere between the fame, the fortune, and the fog of ego, they made choices so baffling they became punchlines. This isn't a hit piece. It's a tribute to 21 British acting icons who proved one timeless truth. Even the greatest minds can make spectacularly dumb moves. Grab your tea, brace for secondhand embarrassment, because the crown jewels of cinema are about to trip over their own spotlights. Before we dive in, if you love stories about fame, failure, and the glorious absurdity of being human, hit that subscribe button. We drop deep dives like this all the time, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. And while you're here, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Tokyo? Let us know in the comments, because nothing says bad decisions like watching this instead of sleeping. 1. Michael Caine. Michael Caine has a face that looks like it's seen every mistake a man can make and learned exactly none of the lessons. By the mid-'80s, he was already a British institution. Equal parts Cockney charm, wounded dignity, and that strange gravelly wisdom that made you feel like he knew something you didn't. But in 1987, he read a script, or more likely someone told him there was a paycheck attached to a script. That script was Jaws, The Revenge, a film so universally panned that it achieved what the shark never could. It ate Michael Caine's credibility in one bite. The movie is famous for two things: a rubber shark that roars, and the fact that Caine isn't in it, at least not mentally. He drifts through the film like a man already picturing his beach house, and that's not a metaphor. When asked about the cinematic catastrophe, Caine famously replied, "I've never seen it, but I've seen the house it bought, and it's terrific." It's hard to hate him for it. There's something almost admirable about the brutal honesty, but there's also something depressingly clinical, like watching a once great artist finger paint for coupons. This wasn't a career misstep, it was a cannonball into the deep end of artistic apathy. And yet, Caine didn't suffer. He kept working. He kept winning. Because in the end, being charming while completely selling out is the most British thing you can do. Still, his choice would set the gold standard for legendary actors doing films they should never have touched. Until, of course, the next man came along, an icon who didn't just accept bad roles, he turned down the greatest ones in cinematic history. And he did it for a reason even he couldn't explain. 2. Sean Connery. Sean Connery spent most of his life being the man every other man wanted to be, until he started turning down scripts like he was actively speed-running a cautionary tale. After Bond, Connery could have done anything. And that's exactly what he did, except he also rejected The Lord of the Rings and The Matrix. In a double feature of What the Hell Were You Thinking?, Connery reportedly said he simply didn't understand the scripts, which, fair enough. Orcs in leather trench coats aren't exactly Shakespeare, but these weren't niche indie films. These were billion-dollar cultural earthquakes, the kind of scripts that, if you don't understand them, you hire a 12-year-old to explain them over lunch. But Connery didn't. He shrugged, declined, and watched as Ian McKellen and Lawrence Fishburne got paid to become immortal. The irony is brutal. After passing on those blockbusters, Connery finally said yes to The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, a film so disastrously incoherent, it made Jaws. The Revenge looked like Citizen Caine. The experience was so miserable, so chaotic, that Connery retired from acting altogether. He said yes once, and it killed his career. There's something Shakespearean in it. The man who played kings and spies undone not by scandal, but by not reading the fine print, or reading it and just not getting it. Connery died a legend, but he also died a man who could have owned a piece of the Matrix, who could have been Gandalf. Instead, he left that to someone else. Someone who wore a cape too long, kissed too many women too young, and insisted he was still the hero, long after the audience knew better. By the way, if you're still here 2 legends in, you clearly have excellent taste in disasters. So go ahead and subscribe for more beautifully bad decisions from the icons you thought could do no wrong. And while you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Are you in London at 2 a.m. with a cup of tea, or somewhere across the world pretending you'll just watch one more? We see you. 3. Roger Moore. Roger Moore played James Bond like Bond had just come back from a cocktail party. Suave, relaxed, and slightly disinterested. It worked, until it didn't. By the time A View to a Kill rolled around in 1985, Moore was 57. His stunt double was younger than his love interest, and everyone, including Moore himself, knew it was absurd. He admitted it freely. Said he felt embarrassed kissing women young enough to be his daughter. But he did it anyway, because when you're James Bond, no one tells you to sit down. They just keep rolling the camera and hope the lighting hides the wrinkles. Watching that film now feels like walking through a wax museum in a heat wave. Everything looks vaguely familiar but slightly melted. Moore had charm, no doubt, but by the end, it wasn't enough to hide the fact that Bond was starting to look like someone's retired uncle crashing a frat party. The action scenes felt slow. The romance felt forced. The villain, played with unhinged delight by Christopher Walken, was the only one who seemed to realize he was in a parody. It didn't ruin Moore's legacy, but it did warp it. He became the Bond who stayed too long at the casino table, winning just enough to justify another hand, even after everyone else had gone home. It's not a tragedy. It's worse. It's a slow fade. A gentle drift into irrelevance disguised as loyalty to a role. And yet, compared to what happened to the next actor on this list, Moore's overlong tuxedo tour seems almost sweet, because at least he stuck with fiction. The next man made his biggest mistake in real life, falling in love with the same disaster, twice. 4. Richard Burton. Richard Burton had a voice that could sell you Shakespeare or a tax scam, probably both in the same sentence. He was magnetic, volcanic, and just unhinged enough to be interesting. In the golden age of British theater, he was the Dark Prince. By the 1960s, he was Hollywood royalty. But what truly sealed his myth wasn't his Hamlet or his Heaney, it was marrying Elizabeth Taylor. And then marrying her again. They were the original celebrity supernova, the kind of relationship that exploded in the tabloids with the force of a collapsing star. The first wedding was a global media circus. The second one was just confusing. People lined up not out of admiration, but morbid curiosity. Watching Burton go back to Taylor after the first nuclear meltdown felt like watching someone sprint back into a burning building for their house keys, while holding a can of gasoline. Their fights were legendary. Their reconciliations even more so. It was passion, yes, but also self-destruction in designer clothes. The emotional carnage spilled across film sets, red carpets, and endless magazine spreads. Burton's health declined. His finances spiraled. His career, once the stuff of awards and awe, drifted into mediocrity. People mocked him not because he fell in love, but because he kept doing it in the most public, ill-advised, operatic way possible. Twice. Like a Greek tragedy rewritten by a gossip columnist. And in the end, what haunted his legacy wasn't that he burned out. It's that he saw the flames, smiled, and walked right back in. At least Burton's downfall came from loving too much. The next man sabotaged his own story with a bottle in one hand and a death wish in the other, and he did it while the whole world watched. 5. Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole once said he enjoyed every drop of alcohol he ever drank. It was a poetic way to describe a drinking habit that nearly killed him more times than anyone could count, including him. If Richard Burton was the tragic romantic, O'Toole was the mad poet with a flask, a limp, and a permanent invitation to chaos. There was genius there, no doubt. Lawrence of Arabia didn't just make him famous. It made him immortal. But instead of building on that legacy, O'Toole seemed to treat fame as a dare. He pushed his body like it owed him something, and it pushed back, hard. He collapsed on sets, forgot lines, was hospitalized so often that producers took out insurance policies just in case he didn't survive the shoot. It was romantic, in that doomed artist kind of way. But it was also excruciating. Directors began looking elsewhere. Roles dried up. He missed out on major opportunities simply because no one could trust he'd show up sober or alive. At one point, he was pronounced clinically dead. He came back, of course, because death itself probably knew better than to try and manage Peter O'Toole. He did eventually recover, sort of. But by then, the damage was done. The mystique had curdled. He became a cautionary tale in his own lifetime, the actor who could have had it all, and instead chose the bottle over the script. But maybe he didn't care. Maybe that was the point. Still, while O'Toole was drinking away his destiny, another British great was doing something arguably even more baffling. Walking away from mainstream stardom on purpose, just when it was finally within reach. 6. Dirk Bogarde. Dirk Bogarde had the face of a leading man and the soul of a contrarian. In the 1950s and early 60s, he was one of Britain's most bankable stars. Beloved, safe, reliable. Women swooned. Studios smiled. Then, at the peak of his popularity, Bogarde did something truly shocking. He walked away. He turned his back on the studio system, romantic leads, and easy money to pursue what he called serious work, which meant independent films, strange European art cinema, and roles that made audiences deeply uncomfortable. He went from playing charming doctors to playing repressed Nazis, masochistic butlers, and men drowning in moral ambiguity. Critics were divided. Fans were confused. The industry was furious. People thought he'd lost his mind. But Bogarde didn't flinch. He said mainstream fame had become a gilded cage, and he wasn't interested in being admired if it meant being predictable. Admirable, yes, but also career suicide. For every brilliant film like The Servant or Death in Venice, there were years where he seemed to vanish entirely. He refused Hollywood. He alienated producers. He rewrote the rules of his own mythology and then seemed surprised when no one followed him into the maze. Some say he was ahead of his time. Others say he was just difficult. What's certain is that he left behind a career that could have been legendary in a conventional sense, and turned it into something stranger, lonelier, and infinitely harder to market. Still, there's a certain glory in self-sabotage when it's done with style. And speaking of style, the next man on this list had it in buckets. Until the drinking caught up, the insurance ran out, and the pub floor became his second stage. 7. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed didn't just burn bridges. He staggered across them with a drink in each hand, daring gravity to do something about it. He had the looks of a classical leading man and the menace of someone who might punch a hole through the nearest wall just to see what was on the other side. Directors loved him. Studios feared him. Pubs considered him a regular fixture. Reed's problem wasn't talent. It was excess. He drank like the world was ending, and he'd been personally offended by the timeline. His public antics became the stuff of legend. Slurred interviews, collapsing on furniture, turning talk shows into endurance tests for the hosts. What began as roguish charm quickly mutated into professional liability. Insurance companies refused to cover him. Productions quietly crossed his name off casting lists, no matter how perfect he might have been for the role. And the tragedy, if you want to call it that, is that Reed knew exactly how ridiculous it all looked. He leaned into it, mocked himself before anyone else could, turned self-destruction into performance art. But there's a difference between owning the joke and becoming it. Eventually, the joke stops laughing back. By the time Reed appeared in later films, there was always an edge of anxiety around him. Would he show up? Would he remember his lines? Would tonight be the night the myth finally outran the man? Even when he delivered strong performances, they felt borrowed, like time extended on credit. Oliver Reed didn't sabotage his career in one big mistake. He did it in 1,000 small, liquid decisions, each one seemingly harmless on its own. And while his legend survives, it does so with a raised eyebrow. Because for every unforgettable role, there's the lingering question of how many more there could have been if he'd ever decided to sit down, shut up, and drink a glass of water. Still, Reed at least pretended not to care what audiences thought. The next man cared very much, so much so that he resented the very thing that made him immortal. 8. Alec Guinness. Alec Guinness was the kind of actor who radiated intelligence even when standing completely still. He was subtle, precise, revered, a master of understatement in a profession that rewards excess. And then, Star Wars happened, and Guinness spent the rest of his life quietly wishing it hadn't. He took the role of Obi-Wan Kenobi for practical reasons. He liked the script well enough. He liked the idea of a percentage of the profits even more. That decision alone made him fabulously wealthy. But fame of this particular kind? He wasn't ready for it. Guinness had spent decades crafting a career of nuanced performances, only to be stopped on the street by people asking him to repeat lines about the Force. He found it embarrassing. He openly criticized the dialogue, privately resented the fan obsession, publicly cashed the checks. Fans didn't mind at first, until they realized he wasn't joking. He genuinely thought the thing they loved most about him was trivial nonsense. The contempt wasn't theatrical, it was sincere. That's where the mockery crept in. Not because he disliked Star Wars, but because he profited enormously from something he treated like an unfortunate rash. It felt ungrateful, ironic, almost comedic. He wanted to be remembered for the bridge on the River Kwai. The world wanted lightsabers. To his credit, Guinness never disowned the role entirely. He just tolerated it with the politeness of a man attending a dinner party he never agreed to. But the damage was done. His reputation acquired a footnote. Brilliant actor, deeply annoyed by his own legacy. And if Guinness resented fame for being too silly, the next man embraced silliness for a far simpler reason: money, and lots of it. 9. Christopher Lee. Christopher Lee had the voice of a cathedral door closing and the presence of a man who looked like he'd lived several lives before breakfast. He was Dracula, Frankenstein, Rasputin, and just about every cloaked menace cinema could invent. He was also painfully honest about why he took so many terrible roles. He needed the money. Lee appeared in an astonishing number of low-quality horror sequels, knockoffs, and forgettable genre films. Some were shot in weeks. Some barely had scripts. Many should have stayed ideas scribbled on cocktail napkins. Critics scoffed. Audiences groaned. And Lee kept showing up, cape in hand, professionalism intact. He didn't pretend they were good. He admitted openly that many were awful. But he had a family to support and a career that didn't always offer the luxury of turning things down. Unlike Connery, Lee understood exactly what he was doing, and that made it both sensible and faintly tragic. The ridicule came not from his performances, but from the volume. There was so much Christopher Lee content that it diluted the power of his presence. The mystique cracked. Dracula became routine. The once terrifying figure turned familiar, almost comforting, like a horror mascot. And yet, Lee endured. He lived long enough to outlast the criticism, reinvent himself, and re-emerge as a respected elder statesman of genre cinema. Still, those years linger as a reminder that even giants sometimes get buried under their own output. But if Lee was mocked for saying yes too often, the next man was mocked for doing the same thing in a different decade, only without the Gothic dignity to soften the blow. 10. Malcolm McDowell. Malcolm McDowell's problem wasn't lack of talent. It was that he had too much, far too soon. and nowhere to put it after the curtain dropped. A clockwork orange made him iconic, a disturbing, brilliant, unforgettable force. And then came the avalanche of straight-to-video thrillers, B-grade science fiction, and roles that seemed designed specifically to make you say, "Wait, is that Malcolm McDowell?" By the 1990s, McDowell's face was turning up everywhere, on VHS covers, late-night cable reruns, and movies with titles so generic they might have been generated by a random plot machine. The drop was steep. The explanation was blunt. He said he needed the money. But it wasn't just the frequency, it was the type of work. No matter how ridiculous the project, he showed up, gave it 100%, and left with a paycheck and a story. To fans of serious cinema, it felt like watching a Shakespearean actor juggle chainsaws at a county fair. Critics mourned what could have been. McDowell, to his credit, didn't. He seemed to find a kind of mischievous pleasure in taking the work seriously, even if the work didn't deserve it. That commitment became its own kind of rebellion, refusing to vanish quietly, even if it meant acting opposite killer robots and discount aliens. He never stopped working, but he stopped being taken seriously. And that's where the pity crept in, not for the man, but for the lost potential, for the reminder that one great performance can open every door, and the next dozen can quietly close them all. But if McDowell was punished for saying yes to too much, the next name on our list was nearly erased for something entirely different, something that had nothing to do with art at all, and everything to do with scandal in a time when scandal could still destroy you overnight. 11. John Gielgud. Sir John Gielgud was one of the most revered voices of British theatre, elegant, sharp, commanding. He could read a phone book and make it sound like iambic pentameter. And yet, in 1953, at the peak of his respectability, he found himself arrested in a public restroom under circumstances that shocked the moral sensibilities of mid-century Britain. The irony was immediate and brutal. Here was a man known for his dignified presence, suddenly dragged through headlines with the kind of tabloid glee usually reserved for movie stars in Las Vegas. At a time when being outed wasn't just career-threatening, it was socially annihilating, Gielgud's reputation took a hard public fall. The press smelled blood. The theater world went silent. And yet, he didn't disappear. He returned to the stage, visibly shaken but not broken. The audience gave him a standing ovation. Something shifted. In an era defined by shame and silence, Gielgud's refusal to vanish became a quiet act of defiance. He rebuilt his career not by running from the scandal, but by facing it down with poise and vulnerability. That courage didn't erase the jokes, though. He remained a punchline in some circles for years, used as a cautionary tale or whispered as an example of fallen dignity. But history softened its grip. By the end of his life, he wasn't defined by the scandal. He was remembered as a survivor of it. Still, the sting of public collapse never quite faded. And unlike others on this list who chose their downfalls, Gielgud's was handed to him, wrapped in cruelty and broadcast for sport. Which makes the next entry on our list all the more frustrating. Because while Gielgud fell from grace by accident, the next man seemed to actively repel it, one toxic quip and ego trip at a time. 12. Rex Harrison. Rex Harrison had the kind of arrogant charm that could sell a musical about phonetics to millions, and he did. My Fair Lady made him a household name, a symbol of upper-class wit with a dry smile and an acid tongue. But behind the scenes, the charm came with a catch. He was reportedly impossible to work with, intolerable to be married to, and allergic to humility in any dosage. Co-stars described him as cutting, dismissive, and often outright cruel. Directors tiptoed, colleagues winced, and yet the industry kept giving him chances, because for a time, the talent outweighed the toxicity. But even the most patient producers have limits. Eventually, Harrison's behavior caught up with him. He burned bridges with a kind of theatrical flair, making enemies out of colleagues and ex-wives with equal efficiency. His reputation for brilliance was increasingly outshone by whispers about his behavior. And the tragedy wasn't that he was mean. It was that he seemed to believe cruelty was just a side effect of genius. That the people around him were collateral damage in the pursuit of art. Or, more often, attention. He was married 6 times, each one a saga, each divorce more public than the last. On set, his refusal to rehearse or cooperate earned him nicknames better suited to dictators than leading men. The industry tired of him. The audience eventually followed. And yet, even in decline, he managed to walk the line between legend and liability. Because there's always something mesmerizing about a man who doesn't care how many people he alienates, as long as he gets the last word. But if Harrison's downfall was fueled by ego, the next actor's story was almost unbearably human, a man who couldn't let go, even as his body and his legend begged him to stop. 13. Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier wasn't just an actor. He was the monument British actors pointed to when asked about greatness. He redefined Shakespeare for the screen, ran the National Theatre like a general in a velvet robe, and turned his own face into a kind of cultural artifact. But by the end of his life, the myth was fighting with the reality. And reality was winning. Olivier kept working long after his body told him to stop. Not out of greed, not out of denial, out of fear. Fear that stepping away meant disappearing. So he soldiered on, through illness, memory lapses, and sometimes painful incoherence, on stage, on screen, in makeup chairs he probably shouldn't have been in. Audiences watched in awe and discomfort. The king of the stage, now visibly frail, struggling to hold lines he'd once thundered from balconies. Directors adjusted, co-stars compensated, critics winced. But no one wanted to say what everyone knew. The greatest actor of the 20th century was no longer himself. Some called it brave, some called it stubbornness. Maybe it was both. Maybe he thought death would come slower if he kept pretending he was still performing. Maybe he couldn't stand the idea of going quietly. Either way, it cast a strange shadow over his legacy. Not ruin, but friction. A reminder that even legends can't escape time. Olivier had once worn kingship like a birthright. Now he wore it like a costume that didn't fit anymore. And while his fall was slow, almost noble in its way, the next man's decline was quieter, less dramatic, more melancholy. Because charm, unlike greatness, can vanish without anyone noticing, until it's far too late to bring it back. 14. David Niven. David Niven had the kind of charm that made you forgive everything. He could glide through a room like a walking martini, dry, sparkling, impossible not to enjoy. For most of his career, he was the epitome of effortless cool. But near the end, even that started to wear thin. He returned to acting late in life, in failing health, with a voice that had to be dubbed over in post-production. Not because he was lazy or delusional, but because he wanted one last run, one last laugh, one last flicker of the old Niven magic. But it wasn't magic anymore. The sparkle was gone. The timing was off. The wit felt like an echo. Audiences who once adored him found themselves feeling awkward, watching a man perform a version of himself that didn't quite exist anymore. Not tragic, just sad. It's not that the roles were beneath him, they were. But more than that, the man playing them was a ghost of his former self. The body was there, but the energy had left the building, and you could see it in his eyes. He knew. Some people age gracefully. Niven tried. But when your whole persona is built on effortlessness, effort becomes a spotlight. Every strained smile, every slow line delivery reminded us of what used to be and what no longer was. He didn't crash. He faded, like a favorite suit left too long in the closet. Still elegant, still technically functional, but not quite fit for the spotlight anymore. And yet, for all his quiet sadness, he never made a public fuss. The next man, however, made a spectacle out of rejecting honor itself, repeatedly, and with the kind of stubborn dignity only a true outsider could weaponize. 15. Albert Finney. Albert Finney didn't care for knighthoods, or medals, or being told he'd earned his place in the British cultural aristocracy. He turned down not one but multiple honors from the Queen, politely, firmly, repeatedly. Not because he was above it, but because he didn't want to play the game. Finney was never comfortable in the spotlight. Even at the height of his fame, he avoided Hollywood schmoozing, hated doing interviews, and rarely explained his choices. And that refusal to explain became its own kind of rebellion. When the press tried to frame his knighthood rejections as political, he dismissed them. When fans tried to call it noble, he rolled his eyes. What really bothered people wasn't that he said no. It was that he didn't care if anyone understood why. In an industry obsessed with legacy, Finney kept his distance. He walked away from major roles, disappeared for years at a time, refused to narrate his own myth. And to some, it looked like self-sabotage. Here was a man who had everything: talent, charisma, awards, and refused to cash in. The irony, of course, is that this refusal made him more intriguing. He became the anti-star, the actor's actor, the guy who could have had a statue in Westminster Abbey but preferred to go fishing. But quiet rejection comes at a cost. He was adored but not worshipped, respected but not mythologized. He chose integrity over icon status. And for many, that choice was hard to understand. The next man made the opposite mistake. He tried to be everywhere, in control of everything, and it cost him almost everything he had. 16. Stanley Baker. Stanley Baker wasn't just a working-class hero. He was the blueprint for one. Gritty, intense, brooding without pretension, he embodied a new kind of masculinity in British cinema. He was the man who could stare down the establishment without saying a word. But behind that quiet, unshakable screen presence was a man who tried to do too much, too fast, and lost nearly all of it. In the 1960s, Baker made the jump from actor to mogul. He wanted control over his films, his image, his destiny. So he co-founded a production company and began greenlighting projects he would both star in and produce. For a while it worked. Zulu was a smash. His instincts were good. He was hailed as the future of British cinema. Rugged, self-made, ambitious. Then came the collapse. He overextended. Too many films, too many roles, too many financial risks. When the market shifted and hits turned to flops, the empire crumbled. The money dried up. The offers slowed. And Baker, always proud, didn't pivot back to being just an actor. He kept trying to juggle everything while the walls fell in. The stress led to drinking. The drinking led to health problems. The health problems led to an early death, just as he was trying to stage a comeback. There's something quietly devastating about Baker's fall. He didn't get scandalized. He didn't implode publicly. He simply tried to build a kingdom that outgrew its king. He wanted to be the boss, and it broke him. But at least Baker chose his burden. The next man had no such luxury. He stayed on stage out of love, duty, or denial, as his own body betrayed him, and the audience watched in a mix of awe and unease. 17. Michael Redgrave. Michael Redgrave belonged to that old guard of British actors who treated the stage like sacred ground. A towering figure in every sense, intellectually, physically, emotionally, he was revered not just for his performances, but for the weight he brought to every word. So when his hands began to tremble and his speech slowed, people didn't whisper. They watched in horror, unsure whether to applaud or intervene. Redgrave had Parkinson's disease, but for a long time, no one said it aloud, not even him. He kept performing. His body visibly weakened. His timing grew uncertain. Yet the roles didn't stop coming, and neither did his insistence on taking them. For Redgrave, stopping was not an option. To stop would mean to surrender, to admit that the stage no longer belonged to him. The irony was thick. A man famous for control, of language, of movement, of character, gradually losing control in real time. Critics, kind but honest, began noting the decline. Directors quietly adjusted blocking and pacing around his limitations. Co-stars covered gently. The audience watched, torn between respect and heartbreak. Some saw it as a testament to his bravery. Others saw it as unnecessary suffering. Redgrave never quite said which side he was on. He simply kept showing up, and in that he became something rarer than great. He became human. But humanity can be brutal, and in Redgrave's case, it was merciless. His decline played out on the same stages where he once held court like royalty. And yet, even Redgrave's battle was quiet compared to what came next. A man whose personal chaos didn't slowly unravel his career. It detonated it. 18. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was a genius. That much isn't debated. He could become anyone. Accents, faces, mannerisms, identities, all swapped like costumes at a masquerade. But underneath that chameleon exterior was no one. Or worse, someone unstable, paranoid, and desperate to be taken seriously while simultaneously torching every bridge that got him close. Sellers wasn't just difficult. He was radioactive. Directors feared him. Co-stars avoided him. Studios hesitated. And yet, they all kept coming back. For a while, because the performances were too good to ignore. Dr. Strangelove, the Pink Panther, Being There. Each role a revelation. Each production a nightmare. He alienated Blake Edwards, the man who made him a star, over and over again. He sabotaged projects with erratic behavior, rewrites, absences, tantrums. One moment he'd be begging for artistic respect, the next demanding scenes be reshot because his aura was off. The myth grew that Peter Sellers didn't play characters. He was consumed by them. What people ignored was the damage left in the wake. He burned through marriages, friendships, collaborators. Then came the health issues, the career slumps, the bizarre decisions. Films that no one understood. Projects that should have elevated him instead left him stranded. Brilliant on screen, impossible off it. And yet, people still wanted to believe in him. He had that tragic magnetism, that haunting sense that, if he could just get out of his own way, he might ascend to the pantheon for good. But he never did. He remained stuck in orbit, circling greatness, forever sabotaged by the gravitational pull of his own chaos. The next man, in contrast, didn't self-destruct. He simply said no, over and over, until Hollywood stopped asking. 19. Tom Courtenay. Tom Courtenay was the quiet revolutionary of British cinema. No scandals, no explosive meltdowns, just choices. Specifically, a long, bewildering list of choices that seemed allergic to ambition. In the 1960s, Courtenay was electric. The loneliness of the long-distance runner, Dr. Zhivago, Billy Liar. He had the kind of raw, understated power that suggested a long reign as a global star. Then he said no, to Hollywood, to blockbusters, to becoming a household name. He turned down major American roles and stayed loyal to the British stage and small domestic films. Not for political reasons, not because he disliked fame, simply because he didn't want it. Or maybe he feared what it would ask of him. Either way, he walked away from a level of stardom that could have changed his life. To be clear, he didn't disappear. He worked consistently, gave great performances, won awards. But he didn't ascend. He didn't want to. And that confused people. Directors were baffled. Fans were puzzled. Why would someone so good settle? In interviews, Courtenay seemed bemused by the whole idea of international stardom. He wasn't rejecting the system. He just wasn't interested in it. And while that earned him respect, it also quietly erased him from the global film conversation. His contemporaries became icons. Courtenay became a footnote, a brilliant one, but a footnote nonetheless. He became the cautionary tale for every agent managing a gifted introvert. Talent alone won't make you famous. You have to want it. And Courtenay, apparently, didn't. But while his self-limiting felt like passive resistance, the next man took the opposite approach, throwing himself into passion projects with reckless abandon, trying to direct the world into caring, and almost directing himself into oblivion. 20. Richard Attenborough. Richard Attenborough didn't walk away from acting. He vanished into directing. For decades. At his peak, when he could have coasted on name recognition and prestige roles, he instead chose to disappear behind the camera. To make the kind of films people warned him not to. He wasn't chasing Oscars. He was chasing causes. Oh, what a lovely war. A bridge too far. Cry freedom. Deeply personal, politically risky, and in several cases, box office poison. Attenborough didn't just want to entertain. He wanted to educate, to change minds, to make epic statements. Noble? Yes. Commercially suicidal? Also yes. And when these passion projects flopped, they flopped hard. He poured years into them. He burned goodwill. He burned money. He burned time. Studios got nervous. Financiers got antsy. And yet, he wouldn't stop. Because Attenborough believed in message cinema, the kind of work that transcends profit. Problem was, audiences didn't always agree. He made Gandhi, finally, and it won everything. That should have been the redemption arc. But even after that triumph, he kept doubling down on dense, difficult films. He wasn't wrong to believe in them, but belief doesn't balance a budget. He returned to acting later, ironically, most famously, as the gentle, grandfatherly figure in Jurassic Park. A blockbuster, a moneymaker, the kind of thing he had once sprinted away from. It was a strange, full circle. The man who once rejected fame through art was now beloved for selling dinosaur tickets. And somehow, that made him even more enigmatic. But Attenborough's creative gamble still paled in comparison to the next man's mistake. One brief negotiation that cost him tens of millions and a permanent place in the Hollywood Profit Hall of Fame. 21. Donald Sutherland. Donald Sutherland wasn't British, but he played enough shell-shocked officers, sneering aristocrats, and grim academics to become an honorary member of the British acting pantheon. He had the voice, the presence, the 1,000-yard stare. What he didn't have, thanks to one spectacular miscalculation, was a stake in Animal House. When offered the role of the aloof, vaguely nihilistic professor in the now legendary comedy, Sutherland agreed. The studio offered him two options: take a small upfront fee, or waive that for a percentage of the film's profits. Sutherland, assuming the movie would flop, chose the former. He got paid. The film exploded. Animal House became a cultural juggernaut. It spawned an entire genre. It redefined American college comedy. It made everyone involved rich, except Sutherland. He reportedly lost out on over $20 million in back-end profits, a figure that haunts entertainment lawyers to this day. The lesson? Never bet against stupid. To his credit, Sutherland laughed about it later, but you could tell the regret lingered just slightly behind the smile. It wasn't just the money. It was the knowledge that he'd made the wrong call, not out of pride or ego, but out of sheer underestimation. And that's the perfect capstone to a list like this. Because it wasn't scandal, arrogance, or madness that cost Sutherland a fortune. It was the oldest mistake in the book. Thinking you're the smartest person in the room. What unites these stories isn't failure, it's irony. Talented, brilliant men, undermined by their own instincts. And in that, there's something almost heroic. Or at least, hilariously human.